Okay, we're going to do the Brothers Grimm Snow White, believe it or not. And the reason is because we're talking about program music this week. The basic idea is music that tells a story. I'd like to show you how literature does the same thing in the Romantic Age. We've talked about art in Romanticism with the Abbey Graveyard in Snow. But literature was actually one of the early forms of Romanticism, and music kind of followed, I believe. So, we'll start with the Disney version, and Disney does something very individual with this. So, okay. Would you mind just...
Oh my gosh.
Just anything that
so
comes
long.
to mind, just any, how does the thing begin? Yeah, just the story.
I don't remember how it begins. I just remember like she's sleeping in one of the dwarf's beds. That's all I remember.
Okay, so it's in the middle.
Yeah.
Disney starts up with this little scene in which she is in the house and she comes out and she sings "Someday My Prince Will Come." Right? They made it into a musical, of course. And so what Disney really does is he focuses totally on the love story. And in the original Grimm story, there really isn't a love story. It's not about the prince at all. The prince comes at the end and brings her down the mountain. But it's not about that. It's about Snow White. And this longing for the man, so to speak, really is sort of 1930s, chauvinism a little bit. It's a pretty little story, but it's a very different story, and it becomes about her finding love, right? And she treats the dwarves a little bit like children, right? And they act a little bit like children, so it's a little bit like she's coming into her own, she finds love, and they too are sort of going through a rite of passage into, not quite adulthood yet, but I mean they treat the dwarves a little bit like children, and they act like children. So anyway, that's not what the Brothers Grimm originally wrote, even though it's an enduring and endearing story. Let's start with the Brothers Grimm. The Brothers Grimm start out with a little classical image, even though the story itself is not classical at all, it's romantic. Does anyone remember, I suppose if nobody's read it here, you probably don't remember this scene. It starts out with the line, "It was the middle of winter, and snow was falling like feathers from heaven." In German, the word heaven, Himmel, means both sky and heaven, spiritual dimension, right? And so there's a double meaning there. It's kind of clever. And the queen was sitting by the window and sewing, and she looked out through the black window frame into the snow and said, and she pricked her finger and three drops of blood fell through the window, strangely enough, into the snow. And she saw that and said, "Aha, I want a child like this. I want a child that is as white as the snow, as red as the blood, and as black, strangely enough, as the window frame." And then she got a child, and then she died. There are a couple versions of this, but in the final version she dies. Now the question is, why is that a classical image of a human being? I want a child that is as red as blood, as white as the snow, and as black as the window frame. We have to think about that for a second. If the snow is falling from Himmel, that German word, like feathers from heaven, and the blood comes from her finger and falls into the snow through a black window frame. The black window frame is the hardest part. What part of a human being is like feathers from heaven? What are we talking about? Go ahead, yeah.
The spirit.
The spirit, sure. And what part of, and then the obvious thing, what part is like the blood from the 3 drops of blood?
Physical.
The physical. There you have it. That's a classical image of a human being. Now, but what is the black window frame through which the physical has to get to the spiritual, or, make a long story short, vice versa? Sure. Not only death, but probably also birth. Right? It's the frame. It's the portal. Portal is a nice word since the video games have taken over. It's the portal between that snow dimension and this blood dimension, right? The physical and the spiritual. And so when the queen says, I want a child who is as red as blood, physical, white as snow, spiritual, and as black as a window frame, basically mortal, right? The frame, that's the portal through which the one meets the other. It's basically saying, I just want a child. The classical image of a child, of a human being, is the harmony of the spiritual, the snow, and the physical, the blood, in this bond, which could be the frame. Right? Beautiful. Snow, but that's not what she gets, as it turns out. So she gets a child, she dies, a new king, the king takes a new wife, I'm sorry, and the new queen is me, right? But at one point or another, this girl is not called. First of all, the girl is not. They don't call her Snowblood frame black, red, white, which really should be her name because that's what she wanted. Right? They call her Snow White, which is already a hint, saying, okay, maybe it's just short. But no, actually, that means something. Well, as we find out. So Snow White is at the spiritual side of it. Well, as it turns out, everything that happens after this is going to reinforce that. Is that it's not a classical notion of a little girl. It's really a romantic notion, because the romantic idea is that we are spirits, kind of trapped for a moment in this physical realm, but ultimately we're not the snow plus the blood. We're ultimately the snow. We're the spiritual dimension, and this physical world is but a shadow. Remember that beginning that we talked about when we started talking about romanticism, right? And so when Snow White is how old? 7. Exactly. 7 years old.
Oh, 7.
Is that what you said? Or?
I thought I said 17.
Oh, 17. No, strangely enough, she's 7 years old when this all happens. And if it were about love, in the Prince, Someday My Prince Will Come, that would be a little creepy, right? So clearly the Grimm's brothers aren't thinking in those terms. They're thinking about something else. And the 7 is a number that comes up again and again in literature, in the Bible, in the creation story. God made the world in 7 days. 7 is the number between the spiritual and the physical, because that's the numerical division between the realm before the world, the physical world was created, and after the physical world was created, right? So there's this borderline. There are all sorts of other usages of the word of the number 7 in numerology and literature and in theology that reinforce that idea. You could get into that. We don't want to spend that time, but let's just accept that for the moment. That she's 7 years old. That's a kind of symbolic number for something or other that has something to do with this borderline, right? So when she's 7 years old, something happens to the queen, because the queen has been going to this mirror and saying, mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest not of all, but in the whole land, which is different, right? Because they had to change it in English because it doesn't rhyme. Spieglein, Spieglein an der Wand, wer ist die Schönste im ganzen Land? It rhymes, right? So who is the most beautiful in the whole land? And the fact that the queen is asking about the land means that she's focused on this physical, geographical, national world, right? She's also focused on a mirror, which is her physical beauty, right? So the queen is obsessed with the physical and this earthly dimension. Snow White, her name already hints that she's not there. And then she's 7 years old, that's another hint. And then the mirror finally gives the final hint, and the mirror says when she turns 7, the mirror finally, instead of saying, you are the fairest in the land, she says, you are the fairest here. But Snow White, Schneewittchen, ist tausendmal schöner als ihr. That's that way. Is 1,000 times more beautiful than you. Not, how does it go in English? Somebody remember? You are the. I think in English she just says Snow White is is a lot cuter than you are, right? And that's not the point at all. It's not about physical. She's prettier than you. She's got nicer cheekbones, right? So and what Disney does is black hair and red cheeks, and the black and red. And it's not about the physical beauty at all. What is Snow White's beauty about? If she's 1,000 times, there's 1,000 times. There's another numerical thing. Throughout literature, when you say you will be cursed for 1,000 years, or you are 1,000 times more this, or brave, or it doesn't mean 1,000. Work it out mathematically. You're going to die in the year. You're cursed for 1,000 years, or the curse will be over in the year such and such. It means infinite, beyond measure, which is exactly what the spiritual dimension is, right? So when the mirror says she's 1,000 times more beautiful, she's saying, I'm not talking about physical beauty. I'm talking about an infinite beauty, a spiritual beauty, and her name has already told us that. She's Snow White, right? She's in that spiritual dimension. And her beauty, therefore, at the age of 7, which is another division, is spirit. It makes sense? Isn't that cool? So the queen, who doesn't understand this at all, is jealous and says, okay, kill her, which makes sense, right? Prove her mortality, right? I want her dead, which is, you might say, is maybe not possible, but anyway, the hunter goes out and says, oh, I can't do it, and then she runs over, and she runs over 7 hills, through the 7, she runs away, she's 7 years old, she runs over 7 hills and gets to the land of 7, so to speak, where there are 7 dwarves and 7 this and 7 that and 7 other things, right? Everything is in 7s. There are no, and then when the dwarves come home, they don't have names. They're not individuals. They're all just dwarves, right? They're not Snoopy and Sleazy and Spanky or whatever their names were. That's Disney's invention, right? He makes individuals out of them, and that's cute for the movie. But it's important that they're not individuals because they're beyond. They're really in a world where beyond the physical dimension. And that may not be clear at first, but it becomes clearer and clearer as we go into the story. Because the queen goes back to her mirror and says, okay, who's the fairest of us? Oh, in the whole land. And the mirror says, you're the fairest here. But Snow White is 1,000 times more beautiful than als ihr, than you. And so again, the queen says, okay, I've got to create this. This is no good. I need to bring her down into mortality. I need her to be dead, so to speak. So she takes. There are 3 attempts on the life of Snow White. Do you remember what those are? The movie only does one. It's just the apple at the end. That's sort of going nuclear at the end. I'll explain why in a second. But there are 2 others. Has anyone heard? The first one is a bodice, and a bodice is basically a girdle. Nobody wears them anymore. Is a girdle, so it makes you pretty, good for the figure. Right? And so she puts on this bodice, and what she does, and of course, Snow White has no suspicions at all because she doesn't live in the world of suspicion. She's beyond all that. She says, "Oh, okay, sure, fine, that's fine." And so the queen who has turned herself ugly, which is an interesting little thing too, right? So spiritually ugly in this dimension. She's beautiful down there, but when she comes up here, she's ugly because she's she's stepping into a different understanding of what beauty is. So she ties this up tight, and Snow White falls down as if dead, literally, first phrase. And then the dwarves come home and they open the bodice, and she's okay. She's not dead. Then the queen comes back. Second time, it's a comb with poison in the comb. So she puts the comb in her hair, the poison takes effect, and she falls down and was dead, literally, and was dead. I believe it's the second time, maybe the third, but I think it's the second time already that the Grimm brothers say. So she's dead. And it's not as if dead, they changed the language. dwarves come home, and they find her there, right? And she's dead. And they take out the comb, and she steps up and says, and they say, don't ever do that again. But she was dead. Now here's the thing. Either the Grimm brothers are really lousy writers, and they forgot that she was dead, and now she's alive again, or they tried to make something magic, and she turned into life, which seems kind of weird, or she's beyond this. She's in a place where death is not real, which makes sense, right? She's in the land of 7. She's 7 years old. She's Snow White, spiritual, but not the red-black part, right? Makes sense? So death is not real. It's very similar to the same idea, which is also a romantic fairy tale in a way, of Matrix. Have you seen the movie? The original? Matrix is about a world that seems real but isn't. It's all sort of pumped into your brain like a video game. And when you die, you don't die, at least the main character doesn't die. He dies, but he's not dead because the world that he's living in isn't real. And that's what Snow White is experiencing, because she's beyond this physical realm. She's in a land, in a dimension where death isn't real. It doesn't exist in the spiritual dimension. Still with me? So, now, here's an interesting detail. Those first 2 attempts on her life, the bodice, the girdle, and the comb, both have a theme that has to do with the queen. And they make no sense to Snow White, but what's the theme? What's their common denominator of those 2 things?
They play some part in physical beauty.
Exactly. They're both about physical beauty, right? And, of course, Snow White is totally naive about it. She just puts it on because she's nice and and has no sense of it, but it has no effect on her. Right? And so this trying to draw her down into the physicalness of the world doesn't work, and it certainly doesn't kill her because death is not part of that either. Now the witch, we call her the witch. Actually, it's the queen. Goes nuclear and gets an apple. And the apple, of course, is symbolic as well, because where in world literature do we see an apple that makes somebody become human, both mortal, right? That's her, Adam and Eve, right? And it's right out of, right? It's okay, this'll do it, right? This'll get her down there. And of course, she takes a bite of the apple and dies. Except she doesn't, because they put her in a glass case. And the next line is a great one. And she dies, but she doesn't decay. That's literally the line in the Grimm brothers. Aber sie verweste nicht. She didn't decay, and which makes sense because she's not physically dead. She's not really physically at all, right? Because how does spiritual beauty decay? It doesn't. Snow White doesn't decay. Snow Red Black would, or Snow Blood Red. Right. Makes sense. So she doesn't decay. So they put her in this glass case up on the top of the mountain, which is also symbolic, right at the top of the epitome of the world, right, which is close to the other dimension. And that's where she remains. And of course, the nice little detail is that the dwarves mourn her for 3 days. They cried for 3 days. And then, of course, along comes the prince and says, I'm falling in love with her. So he says, I want that beauty in my realm. I want to take her along. No kiss. There is no kiss. But it's not about that. It's not about him falling in love with her. It's about him wanting that spiritual beauty in his world, right? In his realm. So he takes her down, and on the way down into the physical dimension, the apple pops out of her throat because somebody trips, right? As one of the pallbearers trips, and the apple pops out. And of course it would pop out on the way down because she's going from that dimension into this one. And that connection, that appleness that creates mortality for Adam and Eve and for Snow White is on the borderline. And so, it's a clever little idea. She pops up, the apple pops out on the way down. And then great disappointment, she marries the prince and has 13 kids and, with a car, a garage, and a dog. Which seems like a letdown, because it's really not about that, and you can tell the Grimm brothers are not the least bit interested in the relationship between the prince that's not what it's about. They dispatch the end of the story in a sentence or two without the least bit of interest. So it's all about transcending into this realm of seven and what that means for the human spirit, right? It's not about what the original queen wanted at the beginning in that very first scene, which was a classical harmony of the spiritual and the physical. It's about a beautiful soul that reaches that dimension for a moment, for a short eternity, so to speak, right, up there, and then is drawn back down into the world at the end, alas. It's like a moment of transcendence, beyond venality, beyond suspicion, beyond evil, beyond physical beauty, beyond death. And then, of course, eventually she becomes mortal, alas, like we all have to do. But in that sense, it's a romantic fairy tale, because it takes us not to the relationship, really. It takes us beyond the world, and that's what all these guys were about, in each in their own way. And of course, now Berlioz is doing that tongue-in-cheek, as is I think Mussorgsky a little less. Mussorgsky worked on this piece, by the way, his whole life. This Night on Bald Mountain with the Witch's Sabbath, this last one. And he was a young man when he started, and he wasn't that great an orchestrator, so he had to work really hard at figuring out, well, if I have 3 trombones here, I can't hear the clarinets anymore. If I have too many of those upper woodwinds, the melody doesn't come out anymore. In the first couple versions of that, he didn't get right. So he was working on this for like 20, 30 years before. And then some other people picked it up and helped him out a little bit too. But in other words, my point is that the Romanticists were all about this in various ways, whether it's witches' sabbaths or whether it's a sense of beauty that is beyond the physical. Yeah.
Now, wouldn't the resolution to that story still be considered classical?
You could say that. You could say that. If the resolution was very important to the story, it would carry more weight. But it's still classical, yeah. If in fact Snow White becomes human, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
And marries the prince, then that in itself is a classical ending. It reminds me a little bit, and your question is a really good one, because it does end up there, right? But it reminds me, the thing that occurs to me is that they're not that interested in the ending. They're more interested in the middle. But still, what you say is not wrong. It's very similar to The Wizard of Oz, which is also a German fairy tale. Why? Because Kansas is a drag. It's black and white, right? That's the physical world. Everything that's interesting in that story happens in Oz, right? And then she comes home at the end, which I think is a little disingenuous. I have to read the book again to see if it's really in the book. And she says, there's no place like home, there's no place like home. And at the end, when she's back in black and white and all these guys are around her bed, she says, well, if I've learned anything, it's that if I'm going to look for something, if I want to look for my heart's desire, I have to look in my own backyard, which is nonsense, right? Kansas is still boring. And she's going to go to, she's going to school in New York City, and she's going to I don't care. So, right? And that's I think, a similar thing. Yeah, she comes back to Kansas. In a sense, the resolution is classical, and Wizard of Oz too. And yet, she says, yeah, but there were really wonderful things there too. And the story isn't really about be happy in Kansas. It's really about, look at this technicolor up there, how amazing Oz is. That's really what the story is about. And so, yeah, there's a kind of slight contradiction in the resolution.
So wouldn't that also support the romantic theory also, that in the romantic period they want to get away from the classical expectation. It still exists, there's still a piece of it there, but the majority of it is the romantic piece.
Yeah, I think that's true. And you know, even in the very, very early days, the Romanticists said, you know, this sixth sense that we're after, we can sense it, and we can, through art and music and the imagination and meditation even, we can get ourselves to the point where we can, out of the corner of our eye, glimpse it, but we always fall back, right? We can't stay there. We can't, you know, even in that, you know, that long orchestral song, I'm lost to the world. I am up here in my loving, in my beauty, and in my song, right? And yet, the thing has to end, and the words stop, and the English horn ends it, and you can't really stay there. And they knew that. So I think, yeah, that's what you're saying, really. Yeah, they knew there was a contradiction with this, that it really isn't a doable philosophy, the romantic vision of another world. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in the United States, I mean, if you want to look at literature written in English, Edgar Allan Poe is the place to go. Now, he becomes a little grotesque, of course. He turns it into a macabre, and some of the philosophy gets lost in things like the gold bug or the pit and the pendulum or things like that, you know, where it becomes almost about fear itself or horror itself. But there's a touch in some of his other stuff. There's a touch of this, you know, romanticism. The movie Matrix is one of the most obvious, I think, as well. That might be worth some time. It's a better film than it seems. There's this sort of orgy of shooting people at the end, which I think is just kind of silly, but it's kind of like an opera or ballet of AR-15s. But anyway, I think we're done. Bye.